Hello, and welcome once again to Reasonable Faith, Logical and Philosophical Arguments for Faith in God. I am Ethan Brown, and I am leading us in this study of the reality that it is, in fact, a logical thing to believe in God, that there are logic-based reasons to believe in God, that it's not just something that fills some sort of emotional hole in our hearts. It does do that, but that's not all that faith is. Faith is, in fact, a reasonable choice. This evening, we are looking at what I have called the strange argument. Because of all of the arguments that we will look at in this class, I think this is probably the oddest one. This is what's called Anselm's ontological argument. It's grouped with the cosmological arguments, but technically speaking, it is not a cosmological argument. It is an ontological argument, which is its own thing. We'll talk about what that is in just a second, but let's go ahead and begin with our introduction to this fine, long-haired, balding man. That's a paradox, isn't it? Long-haired and balding. He had a whole bunch of rabbits that all took a step back because he had a receding hairline. Somebody stop me. This is Anselm of Canterbury, and Anselm of Canterbury was alive from 1033 to the very early 1100s, and he made what has been the bane of philosophers ever since. Philosophy often will discuss the existence or non-existence of God, and just about everybody since the 1060s or whenever it is that he first articulated this have really had to deal with it one way or another because it's just such a strange argument. The ontological argument deals with the idea of God. Instead of interacting with something in the real world and saying that points to God, it deals once again with the idea of God. We've looked at an argument that deals with the idea of God, and we called it the argument from the idea of God. And that argument suggests that the idea of a perfect being has to come from somewhere, yet we live in an imperfect world. So why would human beings generate this benevolent, loving, good, glorious, all-knowing, all-powerful God? Why would we come up with that? Understanding why we might come up with something like Zeus, maybe that makes sense. But Yahweh, that God doesn't really make sense given the evidence we're drawing from. And so looking at that idea, the argument has to do with its generation. Where would that come from? Since we don't encounter anything like it, why would we believe anything like that exists? That's the idea from God. Anselm's ontological argument is also going to deal with the idea of God, but rather than just looking at and thinking about, okay, now what would make that? How would we come up with the idea of God? It's going to look to interior to the idea of God itself and say, based on the quality of this idea, the interior logic of it forces the reality of God. In fact, it becomes logically impossible not to believe in God and at the same time to hold the idea of God in one's mind. One cannot do both of those things. You can't disbelieve in God and then continue to have the concept of God inside your head because of the logical contradictions that will produce. Now, in order to understand this argument, we have to spend just a little bit of time with this big word, ontological. What is ontology? All ologies are the study of. So psychology is probably the ology we're most familiar with. Psychology. Psyche is a Greek word meaning mind or soul. So psychology, it would be the study of the psyche, the study of the mind, the soul. Or theology. Well, theos is the Greek word for God. So it would be the study about the theos, the study of God. Theology is the study of God. Ontos is being. That quality of having existence. So ontology is the study of existence. And the ontological argument is not one that is based on the cosmos, but based on what the idea of God suggests about God's existence. The ontological argument doesn't begin with an observation of the world. It begins just with thinking. And it suggests these logical ideas have these logical consequences. Instead of asking, what am I able to prove based on a cause and effect universe or movement and change, it simply says, what does logic demand? If this exists, then the laws of logic compel this reality. It's important to realize that in the 1100s or late year 1000, the late thousands, that the concept of logic had been really elevated, and people were very, very committed to the idea that logical proofs were perhaps in some ways even greater than physical proofs. That physics and the physical world, that's all real, but maybe not quite as real as logical proofs are real. We have kind of flipped that in our day and age. We live in a time of relativism, and relativism is inherently illogical, so our culture doesn't insist on logic even pointing to reality the way that the folks in the year 1000 did. So this argument will make a lot more sense if you accept the idea that logic is just as real and immovable as gravity. You cannot break the law of gravity because you want to. If you could do that, you could fly. None of you can fly. So we can't break the law of gravity. Well, in the medieval world, the same thought would have been true for logic. You can't break those laws. They are immutable, unchangeable. You can't touch them. You can't get to them to break them. You have to obey them. So if a thing can be proven to be logically so, it has to be accepted. Now, ontological arguments are mostly about God. When you hear the word ontological argument, this is not the only one. It is the most famous one. There are others that exist that have been offered as proofs since Anselm, in the 1,000 years between Anselm and now. Not quite 1,000. It'll be 1,013 years from right now when he was born. But in that nearly 1,000 years, there have been others that have been offered. But they're mostly about God. Now, I suppose if you wanted to prove that anything besides your own mind exists, you'd probably use ontology to do that. Meaning, how would you prove that I'm an actual person and not like in a video game, a non-player character? You know, somebody with no player running it. They're just, maybe I don't have a mind. You know, now you could perhaps prove to yourself that you have one because you're doing some thinking. But how can you prove that I have one? Maybe I'm just a figment of your imagination. You would begin to appeal to the nature of being and the universe around you, the assumptions that you make about what exists in order to get through that. But for the most part, ontology is strictly used to discuss God. So let's get into what Anselm actually did. I think you're going to like this if you can follow it. I'm going to present it as much as I can in kind of Anselm's language first, a slide at a time. And then I'll unpack it as we go, but then I'll have one slide toward the end that will try to offer a more modern sounding language for this, okay? So, Anselm's argument begins like this. It is possible to conceive of a being than which no greater being could possibly be conceived. That is what we would call God. So, what does that mean? Well, you can imagine a being that is the greatest being. Nothing greater than that could be. There's nothing above it. So it would be at the high point of greatness. Okay? Like on Earth, the mountain Everest reaches the highest. It is the highest mountain. No mountain goes higher than that. If a mountain could be found that was taller than Mount Everest, then Mount Everest wouldn't be the greatest mountain anymore. But then go from mountains to just beings in general and go to this would be the absolute supreme in all things. the strongest in power, the strongest in intelligence and wisdom, the strongest in virtue, the greatest in all things. It is possible to conceive of such a being that no other being could be greater than that one. And that is what we call God. So we begin with the definition of God that looks like that. That is our foundation stone for this argument. It's not the whole argument. There's actually, I think, 6 points in the argument, but that's the first one. Okay? Greatest being that exists, no greater can even be imagined. Okay? Second point, the concept of God does exist in the mind, and it fits the concept in point 1. So that first description, that is what we think of when we think of God. When we think of God, we think of a being greater than which no being can be conceived. There's nothing that you could even imagine that is greater than God. If you could imagine something greater than what you're calling God, you haven't reached God yet. You can get into a really big angel or something, but you haven't reached God. But once you reach the point that nothing greater can be conceived, that's God, and it is possible to conceive of that. In fact, that is, in fact, what is in our minds. That's what we think of when we think of God. There's nothing bigger or more powerful or greater or better than He is. No superlative that can be applied to anything beyond Him. He is the greatest. Okay, point 3. A being that exists as an idea in the mind and also in reality is greater than an idea that exists only in the mind. Okay? So, if I have an idea of a particular kind of flatworm, but that kind of flatworm doesn't exist, it's entirely fictitious, I made it up, then any flatworm that actually does exist, or any roundworm, or any worm of any kind that actually does have existence, would be greater than the one that I came up with. And in fact, if I were to think of a person, an imaginary person, like Luke Skywalker, that's not a real person, at least to our knowledge. He lived a long time ago and in a galaxy far, far away. But as far as we know, there's no such thing as Luke Skywalker. Okay? But he is a pretty well-formed idea in the minds of most people that have ever seen Star Wars. They know who that person is. He just doesn't have actual existence. Okay? In Anselm's thinking, an actual flatworm would be greater in excellence in terms of greatness, measurable greatness of a being, than Luke Skywalker, because in addition to having a mental construct, which we've all got of Luke and we've all got of a worm, that worm also has physical, tangible existence. So the worm is greater than the man, Luke Skywalker. Okay? And you could go on from there all the way up to the greatest thing that you could imagine. If that is only in your mind, then you could conceive of something that is greater. Like if you could, let's use Luke Skywalker. You can conceive of Luke Skywalker, and he's really great. But since he's only in your mind, if there were an actual person who really was Luke Skywalker, I don't mean Mark Hamill, who acted as him. I mean Luke Skywalker. That would be greater than the concept that's in your mind. The real Luke Skywalker would be greater than that which is in your mind. So a being that exists only as an idea is not as great as a being that exists both as an idea and as a reality. Something that can be interacted with. Okay? Makes sense? With me so far? Good. I hope so. If not, rewind. Number 4. But if God exists in the mind alone, then it would be possible to conceive of a being that was greater than the being than which no greater being could possibly be conceived. Now, what does that mean? Well, in our first part of this argument, the point number 1, the argument was God, the idea of God is a being than which no greater being can be conceived. You can't imagine anything greater. But if God is only an idea, then you could conceive of something greater than the greatest. That would be, namely, a being that exists both in the mind and in reality is greater than a being that exists only in the mind. So, my idea of God is the greatest of all conceivable beings. Nothing can be greater than him. But if he exists only in my mind, then I can conceive of something that's greater than the being than which nothing greater can be conceived. And that would be not only something in my mind, but also something in reality. That would be greater, and I can imagine that. So if it were just an idea, then I can think of something better that would also have real existence accompanying the idea. So the fifth point, this would be a contradiction, for it is impossible to conceive of a being that is greater than a being than which no greater being can possibly be conceived, and at the same time necessary to do so if God exists only in the mind. And what's going on there? Well, we've got two realities. It would be impossible on the one hand for me to conceive of a being that is greater than the being that is the greatest. That wouldn't be possible. But if God is only in the mind, I'd have to do that, because I'd have to be able to conceive of a being that is the greatest, but also is more than an idea. So I'd find myself in this logical contradiction. And remember, the laws of logic were seen to be as unchangeable as something like the law of gravity. So what I've got there, and by the way, I'm not sure they're not. I don't know that you can actually break the laws of logic any more than you can break the law of gravity. So what you've got is both, it's impossible to conceive of something greater, but it doesn't exist. And on the other hand, you have to think of something greater because you can think of something that does exist. So you'd have these two absolutely incompatible things, and you'd have to hold them in your mind at the same time. And logic won't allow you to do that. And since logic won't allow you to do that, the only thing that you can do is give up the contradiction. But the only way to give up the contradiction is to say, God is an idea in my mind, greater than which nothing can be conceived. But since that's true, he also has to have existence. Otherwise, I will produce a logical contradiction, and that can't happen. Okay? So that's the ontological argument in Anselm's language. Let me give it to you just a little bit cleaned up. I've put it all onto one slide. And so I'll just read through this and we'll be done. So conceptually, God is that being that is greater than all others. When I think about God, that's what I'm thinking about. Nothing can possibly be greater than God. So the idea of God is of the absolute, most magnificent, most glorious, most virtuous, most good, excellent in all things, above all in all ways. So it is the greatest concept that could be thought of. The idea of God is in our minds as just that, a person who is greater than all others and greater than all things. Okay, so when I think of God, that's what I'm thinking of. It's possible to think of that, and in fact, we do think of that. But if God exists only as an idea in our minds, then it becomes possible to think of something that is greater than God. An existent thing is greater than any mere idea. Okay, so if a thing has physical existence, or real existence, doesn't even have to be a physical being. If it has real existence, it's greater than a mere idea. Okay? But then we've got a contradiction. The idea of God is the greatest possible of persons, of whom nothing and no one greater can be imagined. But an even greater person could be imagined if that person also had existence. Therefore, God has to exist in order to avoid a logical contradiction. Okay? So that is the ontological proof. As I said, it is the strangest of all the proofs that we will look at, because it seems to do some double speak and start with an idea and end with a reality. What it's trying to do is to say, if this idea is going to be consistent and obey the laws of logic, which are as immutable as the laws of gravity and the speed of light and so forth. If that idea exists and it's going to obey the logical laws, then the reality also has to exist, or the idea becomes inconsistent and contradictory. So there you go. We'll chew on this one together. I'm sure we'll have some fun discussions. Let's go ahead and close with a word of prayer. Our Father in heaven, thank you for giving us minds that can conceive of really wondrous things. This one's hard, and I pray that you would help us to understand. Bless our minds as we think of you. Above all things, we thank you for Jesus. We pray you'll send him soon. It's in his name that we pray, and amen.